want to extend my thanks to the folks, to all of our sponsors that were mentioned before, but also to Jakes and Associates. They had hosted this event in the past, and they graciously agreed to let us hijack it and do it here at CSIS because it's such an important issue area that we focus on here. Next, I want to welcome to the stage Mike Tierney. And, you know, if you don't know Mike, you should get to know him, and you should get on an email distribution list of Fiscal Track. And he is the go-to guy when it comes to space budgets. And I'll tell you, as a budget analyst myself, I go to Mike's analysis of what's going on in the space budget. And so he's going to come up and deliver a presentation this morning, show you some tools they've been working on, which I believe you can access from home. So those of you who are watching on the web, you can go watch it and play with it on your line. And the rest of you, when you get home, you're going to want to go and play with this data. So without any further introduction, Mike, welcome to the stage.
Thank you all for coming out today. This is our third annual Space Budget Forum. It's grown each year, both in terms of size, support, interest, and we are privileged this year to partner with CSIS for the event. So thank you to Dr. Hamry, Todd, Sean, Thomas, Seamus, and the entire CSIS event team for managing my logistical challenge with this presentation and making today a success. Thank you to our corporate sponsors who have helped support this event. We wouldn't be here without you, so thank you to Braxton Science and Technology Group, Inmarsat Government, Intelsat General Corporation, LinkQuest Corporation, Millennium Space Systems, Orbital ATK, SES Government Solutions, and Vox Space for supporting our event. Lastly, thank you to the entire team at Jakes & Associates for your commitment and energy to supporting me and us in making today a success. I am fortunate to be standing in front of you presenting today, but behind me, not pictured, but right over there, is a team of consummate professionals who share a passion about this domain, about our clients' success, and about getting everybody on the same page about what is the space budget, what is in the portfolio. So thank you to Steve Jakes, Terry Spouts, Tom Spangler, Zach Keefe, Kyle, Michael, the associates who kept the lights running while we were focused on this event. Pause, breathe, water. So we created this event 3 years ago, like I said, to provide a forum for all the stakeholders in the military space domain to get together, and that's primarily the Department of Defense, Air Force, Congress, and industry, to converge and reflect on the new budget proposal for the space domain. And it's certainly an exciting time to be a stakeholder in the domain, and our timing in creating this event is both fortuitous but not coincidental. First, space has again captured the attention and dollars of private enterprise. Investors poured a record $3.9 billion into private space companies alone in 2017, another record, according to investment firm Space Angels. And we heard about it from the members of Congress. Space is becoming cool again. You've got all that money being invested. You've got billionaire celebrities, stunning visual displays of engineering that capture, even if for just a brief moment, the attention of the general public. You've got new capabilities like space tourism, moon and Mars colonies, asteroid mining, small satellite constellations painting the sky black, responsive launch, on-orbit satellite assembly and servicing. The list on the technological innovation side is quite exciting. On the executive branch side, the White House and the Department of Defense are working to outpace the threats that we heard about from the members of Congress this morning. The White House reestablished the National Space Council, making space again a priority for this administration and the Vice President. And as I'll show you throughout the presentation, the DoD is in the midst of some major investment decision points on the very major platforms that support the Department of Defense in space. And they are doing so despite a very constrained budget environment under the Budget Control Act and a never-ending stream of continuing resolutions that also impact their ability to outpace that threat. And as we heard, kind of in spades this morning from the members of Congress, and repeatedly over the past several years, Congress is quite eager to see the department make swift progress in managing the domain. I noted that Chairman Rogers said move faster was his #1 priority for what he would like to see the department do. They want them to make swift progress in managing the domain differently, responding to the threat environment, eliminating our reliance on Russian launch capabilities, both the much talked about RD-180 and on the commercial side, and protecting the entire space domain from cyber threats. So it's against that very dynamic and exciting landscape that I will describe kind of in detail the fiscal year 19 budget request for military space programs. And I essentially have 4 objectives, 4 modules, 4 visualization suites to present that each have kind of their own distinct objective. The first is to provide a little bit of context regarding the scope and size of the DoD space budget relative to other U.S. government spending, and assess a little bit of the impact of the Budget Control Act and sequester as it relates to the overall policy objective of decreasing our deficit, and then the impact specifically to DoD. I'll then go into a summary of the DoD space budget, and identify at a component level the composition of that budget by military department, by appropriation type, and by mission. And then I'll go into those missions to highlight some of the key new things in the 19 budget. Where did money move forward? Where did money move out into the FYDP? What new programs are created? Where is there investments that reflect the new prioritization inside of the department? And finally, I will answer a often asked question or often made statement that is often made without any real substantiation or data behind it, which is, did space take a more disproportionate cut under the BCA of 2013, under the sequester cuts, than the rest of the Air Force portfolio? We think you heard this morning from the members of Congress, there is a perception, whether it's a reality, that space is a pay-for inside of the Air Force's budget, and I have some data that examines that question and provides at least a partial answer. One quick logistical note. The registration page has a link to this presentation that you can all go to here. I can give you the link as well. It's very short. It's cs.is/spacebudget, cs.is/spacebudget, and all the CSIS Twitter, I think, has also pushed it out as well. This data is dynamic, it's interactive, it's publicly available. So everything that I'm doing that I'll show you through this presentation, you can do here with me, along with me, or at your computer. On to the meat and potatoes. So these first visualizations, like I said, are intended to provide a little bit of context and scope about the size of the space portfolio relative to other U.S. government investments. Sometimes we get pretty narrowly focused on and fixated on what is our top line for the space budget. What's that number that we can pin to? But I think it's important to look at this in the most broad picture possible. And since Todd's not presenting this time, I can steal a little bit of his thunder and look at the bigger picture. So up here in the, let's see if I can make this work, top left, this is data that's based entirely from government sources that came out with the fiscal year 19 release. OMB publishes essentially a giant spreadsheet of all federal outlays and all federal revenue. This reflects the outlays portion for fiscal year 19. Just as a note, you can cycle through and, to any fiscal year in this chart, and this number will change, and you can see what the total budget was for that year and the relative proportional allocations inside this chart. So this is dynamic, and you can, interact with it. So total budget, total outlays is $4.4 trillion. That's a combination of both discretionary spending and mandatory spending. The Department of Defense component thereof is $656.95 billion, which represents 14% of the total U.S. government budget. Back up one sec here. So the trend over here is, again, this $4.4 trillion number over time. In this region right here, you can see 2 years of successive declining budgets in 11 to 12 and almost 12 to 13. So right here we have a declining budget year, and then we have sequester kick in. So preceding the implementation of the Budget Control Act, we actually had some period of very brief fiscal responsibility. Sequester is implemented, but then look at the rest of the trend. Overall government spending has not substantially changed in a meaningful manner since Budget Control Act was implemented. But take a look when we switch to the Department of Defense view. So this is the Department of Defense's budget relative over time. And here we see essentially when sequester kicks in and the Budget Control Act caps kick in. And you see a very real dip and decline in actual overall spending by the Department of Defense. And we are now starting to see that recovery. So quickly cycling back versus. So if the overall policy objective when we implemented the Budget Control Act was to curtail the increased and the rate of spending, we did not necessarily achieve that objective because the trend overall has not altered, one bit. But DoD suffered a substantial impact from that. What I'd like to show is why they targeted DoD. So this bubble chart here down in the bottom left is essentially that same $4.4 trillion. Proportionally, each bubble is relative to the proportional size of the budget. And you can eliminate all of the mandatory spending. So things like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. Boom. And we'll take out the net interest. And you are left with why they felt that the Department of Defense would be a good pay for some deficit reduction. Because overall, it is a very sizable portion of the federal budget. And the intent was to look at discretionary spending and find a way to curtail discretionary spending in a way that had a meaningful impact on the overall government spending. In reality, I think what we've heard from the department, from Congress even, and our advocates, is that the reality is that the department basically spent 4 or 5 years dealing with sequester. The overall policy objective from Congress to reduce deficit spending was not met, and we are now kind of exiting the fog of the BCA and hopefully can kind of get back to more of the status quo. These other charts, I did want to give some love to NASA while we were here. So down here in the bottom left, you can see the breakout of what I call the space budget. So this is just essentially the NASA budget plus the DoD components that we've identified. This number is 7.8. I'll get in more detail about where we get to that number, why it's not a number that you've heard necessarily before today. And then this is essentially those two budgets put together over time to demonstrate that they collectively did suffer that impact from sequestration. So if I can get to the space budget here. Okay, so $7.88 billion is the number that our team has built from the ground up to get to what the DoD space budget is. Oftentimes you'll hear a number in the $10 billion range, $11 billion range. You heard from Congressman Lamborn, $8 billion. So let me first walk through how did we get to this number, what is it not, and that will help kind of baseline the whole conversation. The Department of Defense has had what they call a major force program, a soft major force program for space since 2002. A major force program is largely an internal mechanism inside of the Department of Defense that allows stakeholders inside the building to know where the puts and takes are inside of the different missions and the different spending bins. That's been a soft MFP that was effectively just a column that says that's a space line. But there was no real mandate to do so from Congress. In 2016, Congress mandated that soft MFP become a hard MFP with two primary policy objectives ostensibly. The first is to make it more difficult inside of the building to steal money out of space programs to pay for other things. And the second thing was to provide congressional oversight year over year over the trend of the budget in the portfolio. So in 2016, we established a new MFP, From a mechanics standpoint, that causes budget nerds like me a lot of headaches because all of the program elements, the unique identifiers for those programs changed. And so what we've done is basically married that evolution to historical data. So if SIBRs, back in 2013 was getting X amount of dollars, and then the program element changed, the unique identifier changed, we've cross-correlated those so that you have a continuous stream of funding on the program and mission level. So that the MFP was established in 2016. Over the last 2 fiscal years, the Department and Congress have evolved that MFP to include more space lines in it. Ultimately, today, I think there are approximately 98 program elements, uniquely identified programs inside of the space budget that's spread across multiple services. But what this 7.8 number is what we at the budget nerd level can track back to what's publicly available. There's a lot that's not traceable from what is in the MFP to a clear, clean procurement line, RDT&E line, O&M line that allows us to provide kind of meaningful analytics in terms of trends and history. It doesn't include some of the small military personnel line items, certainly no military construction. Ultimately, this number in earnest is probably closer to 10 billion, 11 billion, but for the purposes of this analysis, this is really what the major investments are at the major platform and is the best we could do to build from the ground up. A lot of people throw numbers out. No one shows you their work like your second grade teacher would ask you to do. So I have showed you my work. You have all this available to you to kind of see what is and what is not. And to be clear, if it's not in the department's MFP, but it sounds like a space line, it's not in here. So DARPA's space technology line sounds like a space line. Maybe it should be in the MFP. It's not in here. So it's very much limited to what's in the Department of Defense MFP. And this is a positive story. From the fiscal year 19 request, if you take that universe of the 77 lines that we can identify as being space lines, overall that portfolio has increased by 22%. And what do I mean when I say increased by 22%? There's a lot of different ways that you can compare one fiscal year request to other data points. What we have chosen to do, and we think as a market standard is the most meaningful comparison, is to take what the department thought that they would be asking for all of these programs last year and compare it to what they actually asked for this year. That is more reflective of changes and shifts in priorities than it is to say, well, it's 4% more than it was last year. That's not really a meaningful comparison. And by the way, we still don't even have a final appropriations bill, so we don't know what last year was. So this is a comparison of what the department thought that they would be asking for in fiscal year when they made the request in 18 for this year, 19, compared to what they actually asked for. And when you look at that data set, overall the budget's up by 20%. As we've heard throughout the day, Air Force is the lion's share of the budget. Of that 7.8 billion, we've traced 7.6 of it back to the Air Force. This composition you can see by appropriation type as well. So how does that 7.8 billion break out by procurement, RDT&E, and O&M? You can see here it's largely driven by RDT&E. I think over time, especially given some of the investments needed to capitalize our new platforms, you'll see at least a evening of that distribution as more items need to be actually procured versus developed. And you can also see it by mission. And so these mission tags, these mission categorizations are not from the department, to be clear. This is the proprietary kind of layer that we have provided analysis to effectively bin every single program element exclusively into one of these one mission areas. There's no overlap. These are mutually exclusive. What I'd like to point out here is this 7.8 billion is very much driven by the major platforms in the space portfolio. Launch and the EELV program is by a significant margin the largest investment portfolio. GPS and our PNT constellation, AEHF and wideband global SATCOM, our comms and our polar comms, the missile defense layer, which is primarily SIBRs, C2 is most of your command and control, your ground, your infrastructure. S&T is actually quite a small budget and is really limited to a couple lines, including operationally responsive space, which is now the Space Rapid Capabilities Office. And then Space Control, Weather, and SSA kind of round out our mission portfolios. This aligns, generally speaking, very much to what the department has in terms of the way that they categorize these program elements. So what we try to do is align them and demonstrate what that portfolio change is.
What about MDA? Has it been here?
MDA is contained, there's only one MDA line inside of the MFP12 for space. And so that one MDA line is contained in here, and I'll show that to you in a second here, Dave. So here we are in fiscal 19. You can see that this is just the space budget. If you think back to the last chart that I showed you, the impact of the Budget Control Act, space did not, was a victim as well. It did not escape the sequester cuts. We went back and we looked, and this is the trend over time. So now I'd like to focus a little bit more on the comparison of last year's request to this year's request. And so over here on the left, I'm actually going to do it first by military department, so I can explain it, how these charts work. So over here on the left, you essentially have two data points: last year's request, last year's projected request for fiscal year 19 versus this year's projected request, or this year's actual request. If the bar in the middle is red, it means that this year they asked for less money than they thought that they would ask for when they made the request last year. If the bar on the internal is green, it means that they asked for more money. So generally speaking, across the board, each strata you'll see here is generally an increase, but where there are decreases, it's very visually apparent. Air Force is up 22%, again, very consistent with the figure we showed on the last one. By appropriation type, you can see a shift downward in procurement. This is traceable and largely, if not entirely, due to the fact that they last year said that they were going to buy 2 GPS articles in the GPS procurement line, and those have been pushed out not only into the FIDEP, but into kind of a different acquisition strategy where they're not actually going to be presumably procured by this procurement account. So that's by appropriation type. RDT&E is getting the lion's share of the increase, and it's made up for that small dip in the GPS procurement. And then by mission, you can see, generally speaking, each mission is getting an increase. PNT, the GPS constellation for that shift of purchasing, pushing out is of the next 2 space articles, did see a decrease. AEHF in the comms mission area also saw a decrease. And so then what we can do here to, I think it was Dave's point, what we have here is by mission area, you can go in and you can say, just show me the missile defense programs that make up that mission area. So of these, I believe we have SBIRS. This is the MDA line, and then these are the other components of that portfolio. So again, Dave, the short answer to your question is if it's not in the MFP, it's not in our list. If it is, and we do have basically one MDA line that traces back to the MFP. So I'd like to kind of just cycle through the mission areas here, just to kind of highlight some of the key takeaways from the 19 request. Let me cycle off of missile defense. So on launch, one of the things that I'm pretty excited about is in the small launch realm. The Department of Defense created this year in the 19 request a new procurement line in the Space Procurement Air Force account. It's called Rocket System Launch Program. It has an existing corollary RDT&E line that has long existed and operates out of, I believe it's AD. This new line is intended to respond from what everything the budget justification says and the Air Force is saying. It's looking to respond to the emergence and growth of responsive launch capabilities for the small satellite market. They have the EELV program to get heavy launch and the exquisite satellites up, and the department is earnestly looking to figure out how do they evaluate and leverage the utility of these small launch and responsive launch capabilities. if you're looking like I do year after year for signs in the budget that show that the department and the Air Force are hearing and reacting to what's going on in private industry, you're going to be disappointed most years. But this year is one where you can point to and really say that something like this is a reaction to the market. They have created a new procurement line to go out every year, every other year, and buy small launch capabilities to go put up assets to support missions. The scope of this over the 5-year period is about $190 million. So we took $0 million for launch and small launch and have turned it into $190 million of the FYDP. That's tremendously exciting for the small launch market to see that kind of earnest embracing from the department. How that's executed, how that's operated, a lot of the devil's in the details. I talked about what happened on GPS. They essentially have pivoted their acquisition strategy to move out the purchasing of the next 2 space articles out of the procurement and to dedicate a new RDT&E line to be the investment string to create that next generation of GPS spacecraft. And so they created a new program element for that, for the evolved GPS constellation, and that's kind of largely the story on the PNT side. In communications, I want to go to so this is, you can also do it over the 5-year period or just an individual look, 18 to 19, or you can look as a portfolio over the 5-year period. So while comms is getting, an overall decrease, there are a couple of interesting stories here. One is this contains the budget lines for the wideband SATCOM mission, WGS. WGS has a procurement line to go buy spacecraft and articles. It also has an RDT&E line to develop technology to implement on that program of record. The fiscal year 19 budget continues a trend that's been there for about 2 or 3 years that says, if you just look at the numbers, there is no more money for WGS and for the wideband mission after next year. There's no money next year in the procurement line, as probably there should be because we're not buying any more WGSs, and there's only $6 million in the RDT&E line. And then there's no wedge or money for that future system. So if you would just look at the paper, you'd say that we're done buying wideband systems and we have no plan to invest in a future system. That is obviously not the reality of what's going on in the department. They are very actively and earnestly performing a wideband SATCOM analysis of alternatives. And the hope, I think, particularly from industry, is that as that process evolves, the department will evolve the way that it looks at satisfying the wideband mission. If you think of what capabilities are available in the commercial market that can be quickly and easily adapted into a military environment, Congress, industry, and even the department have all gravitated towards SATCOM as being one of those potential use case areas. So as the budgets evolve, we are obviously going to see a spike to account for that wideband mission and what that stratification looks like in terms of investment. Is it more buying of large government-owned and operated spacecraft, or is it a more appropriate mix of ComSat-Com services with dedicated government assets? One of the other, 2 of the other missions that I want to highlight. So we've talked a lot about the challenge of identifying what is in the space budget. And the reality is there's so much that is not able to be talked about, right? And is in the black world and is just not appropriate to really be addressing. But what we can do is we can look at what's publicly available in the public MFP and see what the trends are relative there too. So the SSA and the space control lines, they're relatively small investments in the unclassified budget, but they are substantially increasing in this budget request. So for somebody like me, that I think is a great sign that shows that if this is happening on the unclassified side, and you see these substantial increases by percentage, a percent change of 146% over what they projected in 18 for 19 for the space control lines. I think that continues to demonstrate a little bit of responsiveness on the part of the department to the threat environment. S&T contains the Operationally Responsive Space Program element. This is actually now, by law, the DoD Space Rapid Space Capabilities Office. And this is a very interesting program element because it's got a long history with congressional support, and it's got a bit of a checkered past in terms of having a well-defined investment mission. It's been used effectively, very effectively, to prosecute individual kind of one-off missions, and that essentially was its mandate. But in the fiscal year 18 defense authorization bill that just passed, they said change that mandate. You are now DoD rapid space capabilities. And so when I opened up the fiscal year 19 budget, I was a bit shocked to see that the budget request for operationally responsive space was up 357% over what they projected it would be in fiscal year 18. So part of me was hopeful that that was, a sign that they heard the message from Congress. They get that DoD needs to move faster, Rapid Space Capabilities Office, right? But when I went into the details and you look at, really what does this program element look like? What is the investment strategy over the 5-year window that's provided in the budget request? So if you just look here, this is the year over year, up 357% and up $300 million, nearly $400 million over what they intended to ask for last year. If you toggle that to the 5-year look, you'll see that it actually, it's still up nearly 100%. But I will tell you, if you look in fiscal years 2022, 2021, the budget request has effectively $6 million, $9 million, $8 million. It's not as if they have injected $300 million into the fiscal year 19 request and have sustained that investment throughout the next 4 fiscal years. The $350 million investment is for a specific capability relative to solar propulsion, I believe. And after that project is done, the program element essentially goes back to approximately $10 million worth of activity. I have to believe that that's not going to cut it with Congress. Congress has repeatedly plussed up this line year after year. The Air Force tried to walk away from the Operationally Responsive Space Program and Office and Program element, and Congress continued to resurrect it and now renamed it. And so I think they're going to want to see a more earnest mission embracing of the DoD Space Rapid Capabilities mantra that's not really currently reflected in this 19 request. To the department's credit, we just got the 18 authorization when their 19 build was already done. So, we can hopefully see some of that in the fiscal 20 request. So I'd like to spend the last little moment here examining that claim that is often made, at least in the world that I'm in, that you heard a little bit, I think, from Chairman Rogers this morning, which is that Air Force uses space as a pay-for relative to other investments in their portfolio. Now, I can't speak to what happens before money leaves the Department of Defense and heads over to Congress. There's lots of puts and takes inside the department that, my analysis is just not in a position to have insight into. I will say, though, that that's why Congress did create the MFP-12 and put all of this money into that major force program, is to make that process of stealing money from that MFP more difficult. But what I can do, and what I thought was a really effective way to evaluate this, is Steve often says, people tell me that space took a greater proportionate share of the fiscal year 13 sequester cut. So he challenged me to basically validate or invalidate that claim. I went into this without any presupposition of what the data was going to tell me, which was scary, because if the answer was bad, I would have made probably a lot of people disappointed. But so we built this from the ground up, and I'll just really quickly walk through the methodology. Each fiscal year reports on prior year spending. So when the 19 request comes out, they tell you what everything actually got in fiscal year 17. So what we did is we went back and we looked at the fiscal 15 request to go get what was actually spent on all of these space lines and all of the non-space lines in the Air Force portfolio. That 13 actual number, the actual number that was spent, is far less than what was actually appropriated by Congress. Little history lesson again, the Budget Control Act requires sequester cuts to be implemented if Congress can't control itself, passes an appropriations bill that exceeds the statutory caps under the Budget Control Act, and then the department has to implement the sequester cuts. So we have two data points effectively. What did Congress give you, Department and Air Force, in fiscal year 13 that admittedly was in excess of what they should have or were statutorily required, able to? And then what actually happened? And when we compare the delta from the space portfolio lines versus the non-space Air Force lines, you would think that if the Air Force was using space as a pay-for, that it would have borne a more substantial burden under the sequester cuts. So we went back and we checked this line item by line item, and overall Air Force RDT&E decreased 9%. And frankly, that's exactly about what it should be, because the Budget Control Act mandated cuts by about 9% at the account level. Space accounted in that same year was down 10%. So you've got about 1.3% difference. I'm not sure that tells the story that we were hearing, that it's being used as a pay-for. That's on RDT&E. This is overall. Procurement is here on the left. So one quick note, obviously the department in implementing sequester can't buy 1/3 of a thing, and so a lot of the pay-fors to implement sequester were paid out of RDT&E. And the overall change to the Air Force portfolio on a one-to-one, apples-to-apples comparison was down about 3.8%, whereas space was down 4.8%. So I think that should give some encouragement to folks that think that there is a cabal back there looking to peel money out from the space budget, because when it comes to probably the most painful moment in the department's history and the most discretion that they were given to implement a statutory cut, space did not really see a disproportionate share. So with that, my presentation is concluded. I'd like to thank Seamus for helping set up, and the CSIS team for making this dynamic presentation happen. I think I've run out of time for questions because I'm a chatty Cathy, but if you have any questions, you can find me during the rest of the event or shoot me a note. And again, thank you all for coming out.
Well, hi. I'm Jen Damasio. I'm Managing Editor for Defense and Space at Aviation Week magazine, and very grateful to Todd for bringing this panel together. I think we've got a lot of real experts on both national security and space, and the budget. We've got some heavy hitters here. We have Bill LaPlante, two down here, who is a Senior Vice President at MITRE Corp and the former head of Air Force Acquisitions. Next to him is Jamie Moran, the Vice President and Executive Director for the Center for Space Policy at the Aerospace Corporation. He was the Director of the Pentagon's Cost Assessment and Program Evaluation Office and a former Air Force Comptroller, so heavy hitter on the budget and knowledgeable about space. Todd Harrison, no stranger to us all, is next to him, and Tom Carrico, the director of the Missile Defense Project here at CSIS, is next to me and has really established himself as a leader on that topic. So after hearing everybody through the morning, our panel's mission is really to address a few questions. What are the biggest challenges for national security space? What should the priorities be, and how does this most recent budget request stack up to the threats and the challenges that the U.S. is facing? So I think I'll start with Bill LaPlante, go to Jamie Moran, to Todd, and then back to Tom. And you guys can open it up, and then I've got quite a few questions, and we can see where the audience takes it.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for having this, and thanks, Todd, for hosting this. So I'd say we have sort of won the lottery with the budget agreement. Hopefully they'll get the CR resolved in the next week or so. But like somebody who wins the lottery, we hope 2 years from now we're not going to look back and say, where'd the money go? So this is the chance really to think. Going fast and thinking are not mutually exclusive. So it's time to think. Okay, so that's point one. Point two, in a couple areas which is not getting attention, we need to reinvest in space. What am I talking about? First is that in the missile defense mission. We just saw in the last presentation all of, I think, $30 million being spent by Missile Defense Agency on space. That will change. That has to change. They need a space layer for their mission. You know, they had PTSS started a few years ago. It was canceled. They are going to need that. The second point is we all talk about nuclear triad recapitalization. Columbia class, B-21, program close to my heart, and GBSD, the follow-on to Minuteman. Depending on which number you use or which budget analyst you talk to, it's hundreds of billions of dollars. What people forget, or maybe they don't forget but they don't talk about, is the space component of NC3 is critical. Okay, protected communications. We have an architecture today that's probably not the architecture we need for tomorrow or even today. I'll just be blunt about that. Whether it's the detection side on the SIBRs or it's the communications on AEHF. That has to be fixed as well. So what we're facing as a country is, in space, is we have all the threats that everybody's alluded to, but we have to build a new system for missile defense, we have to build a new system for protected communications and for sensing. And that's the ugly truth. And the final point I'll make is, I didn't learn this till I got in the job, and I learned this from Professor Moran to my right, is that actually there's RTT&E and there's RDT&E. Okay, there's R&D when you're doing experiments, prototyping, DARPA, yada, yada, yada. And then there's, no kidding, developing a new system, like we're doing right now with the B-21. So when you see that drop in the space budget and RDT&E that some have shown over the last year, yeah, it's because we were done with AEHF, we were done with SIBRs. We were really only thing we're developing right now that's costing a lot of money is the new rocket to get off the 180 and spending all the money on the OCX GPS ground system that everybody is all upset about. Which, by the way, if I remember right, the bid on that in 2009 was $800 million. The independent cost estimate by our friends at the Cape was probably about twice that, 1.6 billion. And now we're at 6 billion and counting on that program alone. So we've got a lot of heavy lifting to do. And renaming an office is a great thing. I love renaming an office. Did they get a new t-shirt that says Rapid Capability Office on it? But how much money did we see in the last briefing that they're getting? A THAAD-T terminal, which is an AEHF terminal, to receive the AEHF is $10 million. I think what I saw in the ORS, if you exclude one of their programs that's happening in 19, is a couple of THAAD-T terminal equivalents of spending. So you're gonna have to spend a little bit more money to do something serious. I'll stop at this point.
So I think Bill made some really interesting points there. I want to jump on one of them up front and then raise what I think is kind of the key dilemma that the department and the national security community is facing going forward, and then close with some hope. Bill said it's time to go fast, but it's also time to think. And I think that is an extraordinarily important point to keep in mind. It's a point that is going to be hard to keep in mind because of two major trends that are going on right now in our environment. One is the enormous energy on the commercial side and the growth of capabilities of military relevance from commercial vendors working for commercial purposes. The second piece is the rise of the threat. Take those two things together. The rise of the threat means we've got to think about space as an enterprise. Adversaries, especially sophisticated adversaries, are smart. They're going to look to our weakest link. And that means if you fix 7 parts of your enterprise, but your 8th part, which enables the other 7, is weak, your investments in the previous 7 are really not going to yield the return you expect. We've got to think as a whole. But when you're dealing with harnessing commercially developed technologies, you are almost certainly going to get piece parts. And the integration between them can be facilitated if you adopt, smart open standards. There's all sorts of good things you can do to piece them together in a better way, but they put you at risk from that enterprise vulnerabilities perspective. You've got to be really smart about that. And so that goes to this point. We want to move fast. We want to harness the commercial innovation to enable the moving fast. We've got to clean up our bureaucracy to move faster. We've got to improve our tool set so we can react quickly. But that doesn't mean jump spasmodically. That doesn't mean act purely instinctively. We've got to look before we leap in a serious way. This is something I saw over and over again in CAPE, right? Analysis of alternatives took too long. But what really took a long time is if you started an analysis of alternatives and you were thinking about the wrong questions, and you went and you did 8 or 10 or 12 or 16 or 20 months, and you realized at the end you hadn't gathered the right data, you hadn't done the right analysis because the question was wrong. You got to get that right up front. And that getting rigorous analysis there is really key. So, time to go fast, I agree. Time to think as you move so you don't make mistakes and to harness the powers out there. The final point is, I'm gonna have to channel the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy here. Don't panic. Don't panic. If we were having this conference in a rising near peer or peer competitor, they'd be looking at us and they'd be looking at everybody in the room here as part of the team. They'd be looking at the fact that a South African guy came to the United States to start his space launch company after making millions and billions in e-commerce. Yep. They'd be looking at the fact that when a publication like Fast Company lists the most influential, fast-moving space companies in the world, almost every company on that list has set up business or operations in the United States. If we're thinking seriously about great power competition and deterring and, if necessary, winning great power conflict, those wars are either very, very brief and ending poorly for all of humanity, or they're big, existential, sustained conflicts that stay below the nuclear threshold. And if they're the latter, the arsenal of democracy is all those innovative companies. So we shouldn't panic. We should be proud of what our space industry is accomplishing, of the innovation that's happening in the United States. All of the excitement almost in launch is here. Almost all the excitement in business applications is here. So we got to harness that. And the government is a customer for it. It's not the only customer. That's the big cultural change. And so the government's got to figure out how to take advantage without destroying that innovation. But I think that's absolutely accomplishable. And if we make our smart choices, we're going to be in great shape.
You're here.
So, I want to go back a second to Mike Tierney's presentation and just let something sink in for a minute. Now, granted, he can't include in there all the classified space, so, there's stuff going on there. I'm sure there's a lot. But of the unclassified part of the space budget he was briefing, and even if you include that there are some little slivers of funding here and there that we could probably count as space that aren't included, officially in MFP 12, he's coming up with about $8 billion in annual funding. Maybe if you include those other slivers, it gets up to $10 billion a year in funding. That's about what we spend on the Joint Strike Fighter program. One program. Now, I'm not here to criticize the Joint Strike Fighter program. I'll do that in a later panel. Different event. But you know, look at what we're spending on that one program, and then look at what we're spending on all of unclassified space combined, not national security space. And what's included in that unclassified national security space? Think of all the mission areas that are included. Missile warning, positioning, navigation, and timings, our GPS systems, space situational awareness and space control, satellite communications, 3 types of satellite communications, protected SATCOM that we use for nuclear command and control, wideband SATCOM that are the big data pipes that go to our troops, and narrowband SATCOM that the Navy runs, actually, that do, you know, basically like sat phone service. And weather is also included in that. All of those mission areas combined are about as much in the budget as one aircraft program. So that's something to think about. Now, you know, is it enough funding? Should we be spending more? Well, you don't want to spend it unwisely, so you don't want to just increase the budget just for the sake of increasing it or so that it matches up to some other arbitrary standard. But we do have to ask ourselves, are we shortchanging this? In a total defense budget of $700 billion a year, which is what we're going to now, $700 billion a year, is this worth more than 1%? 1% of the budget? We should be asking ourselves that hard question. Now, I agree with Jamie, and we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves because we do have all the things we need to succeed, right? We have a $700 billion a year defense budget. My God, that ought to be able to buy some national security. It really ought to. And you look at what Congress has been doing in this area. We heard from members of Congress before. They have given DOD and the Air Force the authorities that they've requested, and it's like pushing on an open door. If the Air Force and DOD come back and ask for more authorities, if they ask for things that in the past Congress might have balked on, they're likely to get it now. They can get a lot, right? They have the authorities that they need. They can get more authorities if they don't have what they need. $700 billion a year, you got the budget that you need. We certainly have the talent and the technology in our industrial base to do what we need to do. It's all about execution. It's all about execution right now. And so I think, you know, the ball is in the court of DOD and the Air Force to deliver on this, to do what needs to be done for the nation. I think the tools have been given to them or are available to them. About execution at this point.
Todd, if I can real quick, and you're pushing on an open door point, we're about to have a key test case, right? Because the Congress is considering the FY19 appropriations bills right now. They were written a long time ago, but they still have to put together that omnibus.
The 18.
Sorry, 18, thank you. I just did that in writing too.
It should be the 19.
The 18 bill, the 18 omnibus is still not final. And you're hearing over the last few weeks, department leadership starting to talk about their concern that with bills coming halfway through the fiscal year and large increases in those bills, that they're going to have a hard time getting the money out the door. And they're asking, still in general terms, but they're asking the Congress, can you give us some flexibility to allow more money to carry over between fiscal years so that we're not rushing to get the money out the door? The authorizing committees, I've heard a number of statements from members of those committees making that point. But it's over to the appropriations committees to write the omnibus. It'll be very interesting to see, do they offer the department a little more flexibility there? It's been an item the department's wanted for years, but it is fundamentally Congress's power of the purse.
So this is interesting. So the Sea Power Caucus has made a push to get that extended time for Navy O&M funding. I haven't seen anyone ask specifically for space, right? And if they ask, I really think they're pushing on an open door there. They've got champions. We just heard 4 champions for space power here this morning up on the stage. They've got more people than that even in Congress I think will back them up. They need to be asking specifically for space.
I would just also add to what Jamie says. You know, the puppy has caught the truck, I guess, in this case. The Air Force has gotten almost all their acquisition programs back in space, right? Except for OCX. They probably don't want that one back.
Sure.
But, so now's the time. Now, the other piece of this, people focus, former acquisition executive, on acquisition authority. Yeah, that's really important, but there's 2 other legs to the 3-legged stool. The second leg is requirements, and the third is budget. Okay, the ability to trade in an agile way across those 3 things is key to moving fast and being smart and moving fast. Okay, so what the Congress also can help with is allowing for more flexibility in moving money across portfolios of space programs. So that's something, if this door is open, we should use that. And now let's talk quickly about requirements. We have AEHF satellite, and it can do lots of things. We have ground systems that connect to it that are very expensive. FAB-T is a ground system for AEHF, $10 million each, okay? When you actually look at it and you say, why does it do all this stuff? This is for, let's say, nuclear command and control. It's like, well, it's nuclear command and control in the extreme case, but we got to do protected comms all over for these other missions. So that's when you end up with Battlestar Galactica. So I used to tell people this. I used to hear briefings that says that we want a system that'll go seamless communications for the warfighter, but that gracefully degrades to the nuclear capability in an emergency. Okay, but you know, you'd never say to somebody, hey, I want a missile, a small missile, low collateral damage, tri-mode seeker, hit a truck going 50 miles an hour for the counter ISIL fight. Oh, by the way, have it degrade gracefully to a Minuteman III for the nuclear scenario. So the requirements piece of this is just as important as the acquisition piece.
So I'm going to dig into another piece of what Bill put out there at the very beginning, and that's specifically the missile defense and space piece of this. The budget from a couple weeks ago has $12.9 billion for missile defense. It's 9.9 for the Missile Defense Agency and about $3 billion in modernization anyway in the services. Now that kind of sounds like a pretty good number. If not the lottery, it's pretty close to it in terms of the high top line for MDA at least. But I'm going to suggest that I think in many respects that FY19 request is very disappointing. And it's disappointing because it's very much a capacity budget. It's getting more GBIs and more standard missiles and more THAADs and more PAC-3s, and that's great. And that is, I think, especially sensible if and to the extent that you believe you have a very near-term need to play catch-up for some past shortcomings on the procurement side. The disappointing part of that is not the 12.9 number, it's the lack of the more advanced capabilities in that pot. Because if it's a capacity sugar rush, I would say that there's a lack of beef in terms of those advanced capabilities. It's not the best metaphor, but it's what I'm running with. And it was in particular for space. So the last 5 administrations have had a space-based sensor layer for missile tracking and discrimination, not just the warning stuff, but tracking and discrimination as a key element of our long-range missile defense enterprise on paper.
Is it deployed yet?
If the FY19 budget goes through as in this form, this administration will be the 6th such administration to be very emphatically committed to those paper satellites.
There's some great studies, though.
Well, you know what? The head of the Missile Defense Agency has been out there with this presentation on a number of occasions, and he's got this nice tagline, the time for studies is over. And General Hyten is out there all the time
was sarcasm.
saying, oh, I picked up on it. Okay. I'm quick, I'm swift that way.
Okay.
Out there all the time saying we got to go faster and all this kind of stuff. But you look at the FY19 budget for missile defense and space, it's a lot of time and it's a lot of studies. And so actually, I wasn't here this morning. I was over at another event with General Hyten. And I said to him, I got the mic and I said, I'm looking at the budget, where's the space sensors? You know, can't we bring that left? It doesn't match up with the thing. And he said, yeah, the MDA's got the design, Air Force agrees with it, and it ought to be brought to the left.
I would wager that the new USD R&E is going to weigh in very heavily on this.
Well,
that he's not interested in studies.
We are in an awkward situation that the Missile Defense Review is not yet out. And so it is in some ways appropriate to be patient. So we hope that when that comes out, maybe next month, it will say some things. And just as in the FY18, there was a big $4 billion missile defense and defeat enhancements amendment, you know, I think that's the sort of thing that would be appropriate for sometime later in this year, because Congress has likewise said, hey, no, we want you to go after this space thing, but it's not there yet. So I think it needs to be pulled to the left.
So I'd like to follow up on that a little bit, since we have 2 folks here who were recently in the administration. What has been the logjam with that? What has prevented you from moving forward faster with those space sensors that plenty of people say are needed?
Well, there's different stories. So some of you may remember that it's still up there and still active, something called STSS. That is still, it's basically, I think there's 2 of them. They were essentially prototypes that are still working up there. They're well past their lifetime. The plan was then to do a full constellation called PTSS, for Persistent Tracking Surveillance for Missile Defense Agency. They were often executing to that. It was being studied. And then somebody came in, and it was including the Congress, and said, we don't see the full analysis of alternatives that justifies this. So the program was stopped, and it wasn't started again. And so I'm not going to pick on analysis of alternatives because my friend Jamie, the head of CAPE, and I love CAPE and I love analysis of alternatives, but for whatever reason, we've allowed ourselves to get into this paralysis over the years into the analysis of alternatives cycle and then not getting out of it. And I don't think it's the fault of the analysis of alternatives itself. I think it's really decisions. So you've heard probably many times John Hyten talk about, well, I'll just say it, I'll quote myself. We spent 2.5 years doing analysis of alternatives of what's the future for beyond AEHF, beyond SBIRS. And after 2.5 years, we said, do sort of the same thing. And then people said that's an unsatisfying answer, and we're still talking about it. Okay, and the Chinese aren't doing that. The Chinese are not talking and doing studies. So it's what I said at the beginning. We need to move fast and we need to think, and they're not mutually exclusive. So really what it has come down to, and Jamie would know this better than me, is actually the decision to spend the money. And decision to spend the money. That's the hard part. As Frank Kendall used to say, the key point in a program is when you issue the RFP for the development. Everything before that, AOAs, risk reduction, all that stuff, that's just whatever. But once you get to that point, you're serious. And we never got to that point on any of those programs.
And PTSS was a victim of timing, right? It was approaching some critical decisions right in the middle of the sequester fund.
That's exactly right.
And it became a bill payer in the face of sequester.
That's exactly right.
Well, this 19 budget now has funding for moving beyond the analysis of alternatives on SBIRS and a plan for going forward. But you're saying you don't see enough in terms of sensors supporting that?
Well, for the hypersonic stuff, I mean, there's a study, I think it's like $600 million over the course of the FIDAP for the hypersonic thing, but I think it's still way too far out to the right. I think where they're putting their money, there's $2.5 billion in the FIDAP within MDA for 2 new big ground-based terrestrial radars. $2.5 billion in the FIDAP. And so even though everybody says, you can't, there's not enough islands in the Pacific to do this, we keep trying to look for new islands in the Pacific to do this. And I think that actually that is a question. Should we ought not to just pull the trigger on the space thing?
So I don't want to be Dr. Gloom here. As Jamie points out, we have the capability to do this. And I'll remind everybody about Operation Bird Frost. It's coming up almost on 10 years. Where remember we had the tumbling NRO satellite, and the missile defense community, the labs and the contractors rallied within about 3 months and figured out how to do an Aegis standard missile to shoot the thing down. If you saw any of that up close, it was like the Apollo story. So we can still do these things. But now let me be back to Dr. Gloom for a second. In the hypersonic glide vehicle, China and Russia are ahead of the United States. We tried twice with DARPA to do a hypersonic glide experiment called the Falcon series. And they both failed. They were both, it's a very hard technical problem. It was a thermal management and aerodynamics issue, 2010, 2011, that time frame. And we stopped as a country. Okay, we're just now going to start up again. The Navy just did one. Elon Musk did not stop after the second failure of landing his first stage on the barge. Neither is the person in North Korea. They're just continuing to do it. So this gets back to, we have to have the ability to have failure and keep moving fast. So we are behind in hypersonic glide vehicle, and that's a mission that MDA has right in its lap right now.
And I mean, that's part of it speaks to the risk aversion that is endemic to the defense acquisition community now. Because if you have a failure, you get beat over the head.
Who did you hold accountable? Who did you fire?
And what we ought to be looking at is for these R&D efforts, the things that are hard technologies. Is if they don't fail, that means they're not trying hard enough. It's like, I remember when I was learning how to ice skate, you know, if you don't fall, you're not trying.
I said if the Air Force had tried to land the first stage in a barge, we would have tried it once, and then we would have had an IG investigation, and we would have been told who did you fire, and all the waste of taxpayers' money. So we've got to get that out of our system and out of our culture.
Failures are a success, right? That's how you understand what didn't work.
The idea is to learn.
Exactly.
Is that the official position of the Center for Strategic Innovation?
Yes. I fail often. Fail big, fail early.
Where is John? This should be an item for a performance appraisal process. The point is a really important one, right? And it's actually something we've got to come to grips with across the space enterprise. NASA is talking about doing some pretty big and hairy exploration things over the next several years. And how will the United States react politically, emotionally, if one of those is a human space effort and it fails? That's, those are, we have a lot of privileges operating in a democracy. One of them is not relaxed and introspective response to failure.
You know, I want to pick up on one thing that, Jamie, you said earlier about if we're serious about the NDS kind of thing, if we're serious about the great power competition in the missile defense, air and missile defense area too, that means that it's not just going to be about the highly predictable, very ballistic looking paths. It is all these other things as well. But, you know, I guess I look at the reaction to the NPR and the kind of, I would say, grinding of teeth about, I think, a review that took the principle of great power competition pretty seriously and said, no, we need to go do something different. And everybody says, whoa, you can't possibly do anything new or different. And so then it raised the question, well, you know, I look at the FY19 budget on the space sensors. We're kind of doing the same thing over and over again. You know, if there comes forward a proposal to actually pull it left and to talk in a more articulate and upfront way about putting missile defense and great powers in the same sentence. The question is, are we going to be willing to have that conversation, or are we going to have more wailing and gnashing of teeth about, I think, kind of holding us back from that? I hope it's not the latter.
So it was mentioned earlier, I'll turn over to Jamie in a second, but it was mentioned earlier by the congressman about the American public. You know, and even as old as I am, I'm younger than Sputnik. But I am a fan of The Onion, which is a satirical news thing. And I remember they put out, in 2000, they put out Our Dumb Century, 100 years of Onion headlines. And I remember the headline for Sputnik was, small bleeping ball scares the heck out of the United States, and the United States freaks out. If you remember the reaction that this country had, or you read about it for Sputnik, if you knew, and this, I hate to say this, but if you actually saw what was going on every day in space today, you'd be saying, what? We reacted like that to Sputnik, and you see what's going on today in space? So there does need to be an education of the American public. You know, the John Hyten 60 Minutes thing that everybody was a great show, that was a deliberate strategy to begin to educate the American public. We need a lot more. I don't know, it's easy for me to say this now that I'm outside the government. I don't know who we're afraid of giving information to about what the Russians are doing in space. The Russians know what they're doing in space.
At least some of them do.
I wanted to kind of revisit something one of the congressmen said, that they'd like to see the SBIRS program move faster. One of the, and Todd, you pointed out that it will move faster under this current budget plan, but one of the impediments to moving faster has been this requirement for nuclear hardened satellite. That's a difficult thing to do, right? And there's one contractor that does it. Separately, there are problems with moving faster to adopt commercial technologies because of contracting vehicles. So I was hoping you guys could discuss what some of those impediments are in detail and what the Air Force might be doing to change them.
Yeah. I mean, you're getting at the heart of some of the challenges in space right now, and it's really about figuring out what you need and what your architecture is for providing it. So on the missile warning side, you know, some of the concepts out there are take SBIRS as it exists today, which is a very sophisticated sensor that offers, initial warning if somebody launches something, but also a whole bunch of other information that is very valuable to the joint force and supports missile defense and other things. Or do you do something very simple that's just letting you know, hey, somebody's lit off a rocket and it's big and it's going in your general direction? If that's all you're trying to solve, that's a significantly simpler technical thing, whether it's nuclear hardened or not, and it can be done more cheaply. There's a non-recurring engineering bill when anytime you do something new, by the way, and so you may pay more up front, but in the long run, it's a simpler satellite. But then, that means if we do build a missile defense layer, PTSS replacement or stand-in, it's got to be more sophisticated. So you've moved cost from one bin to another, but on an enterprise level, have you made it go away? Those are the tough questions. And by the way, they're in different people's budgets, which is a political issue. So that architecture and enterprise level balancing is where we've typically fallen down. And it's one of the interesting ironies, right? This is probably the strongest case for a unified space enterprise, but the proposals that we've seen for a unified space enterprise don't actually pull those disparate parts together.
Right.
And there's some good reasons for it that the congressman laid out this morning why they didn't go further.
Right.
But many of the benefits of the unified enterprise come from crossing all of those, and obviously bureaucratically nobody was ready to make that proposal.
So my kids would rather talk about the logo of the Space Corps than about how to do rapid acquisition with other transactional authorities. So that's the part that we also have to focus on. I would also...
We have to focus on the logo, you mean?
Yes,
or?
the logo, yes.
Okay.
I'm not for or against it, I'm just making a joke. So just a comment on something that Jamie brought up, and we don't say this so much in the public as much as we should. The missile warning system, I'm not talking about missile defense, I'm talking about missile warning, okay, was designed and set up and built by this country during the Cold War to give impeccable confidence, God forbid, to the leadership of the country if there was a launch against the United States in a timely fashion. And there's something actually called ITWA certification, such that it didn't give false messages, right? So think about, this gets to my requirements thing I talked about earlier. So you're supposed to build that still, right? But everybody knows that that's probably the unlikeliest of the unlikely scenarios. It's not the North Korea scenario. And so we have to figure out, which parts of the Cold War stuff do we let go? What does modern deterrence, modern sensing mean in the 21st century? Not in the 1960s with Curtis LeMay. We're talking about 2020. And what's the sensor layer need to look like? And do you need something called ITWA certification and all the nuclear stuff? There's not an easy answer to that question, but those are the things that have to be decided right now.
I've got a question from the iPad for you, Todd. If the Air Force has the authorities it needs, the budget it needs, and they can push the door in Congress, do you believe they should be afforded the time to execute changes in space without battling Congress on keeping the force intact?
Yeah, but they've got to show progress, or as we heard this morning, Congress is going to be right back at them. And by show progress, it's within the next month or so. They've got to report and show Congress. And a lot of this has got to come from the Deputy Secretary because that's what Congress mandated in the last NDAA. They've got to show that they're really they're moving out. They're doing the things Congress wants them to do. They got to show that they're doing more on the personnel side, developing a space cadre. They got to show that they're using authorities, that they've got real plans with the Space Rapid Capabilities Office, but they've got to do it quickly. If they don't do it quickly, Congress will be back and will be pushing them more.
Right. You can view it as a congressional problem or you can view it as a space superiority problem. I choose to say it's space superiority is the problem.
Here's another question from the iPad. With voracious competition from the commercial market, how can national security users secure enough spectrum to maintain flexibility that they need to operate?
One thing, I'll say a few words and I'll turn it over to these guys. One thing I think is really exciting is we have now software waveforms. So commercial satellites that are already up there right now in orbit There's no reason the government can't purchase and form its own waveforms and use them now. That's a small thing. You can probably buy it as a service. So there's examples like that that are really exciting that we should just go out and do. The intelligence community, the NRO, as well as NGA, National Geospatial Agency, and NRO National Constructs are moving out on this very fast. What type of commercial sensors they can use to augment their classified sensors, how they pull that together. So a lot of exciting things going on. I will, though, say this. I hate to be the downer on space launch, but as I keep saying to people, we all want off the Russian engine, we all want competition, and we all want 2 independent ways to get into space or more. We're not going to get any of those, maybe one of those 3 in the next 2 or 3 years.
So on the spectrum thing, Jen, first, the Center for Space Policy and Strategy put out a report on spectrum issues just about a month ago, Bracing for Impact, and we're looking at some of the pressures on traditional space spectrum that we use for government missions, actually mostly civil missions and GPS, they're getting pressured. And the bottom line there is we're non-advocate, right? So we're not coming in with hard recommendations, but we're trying to lay out and crystallize the issues. And the bottom line there is what the country needs to be able to do is balance a whole bunch of priorities simultaneously, understanding the economic advantages of making more spectrum available, but also understanding the costs and the lead time associated with moving missions, right? Some of the software-defined radios and other technological advancements let us be more spectrum efficient, but there's limits to the physics. Yeah. And when you have satellites that are on orbit for 20 years, with non-software-defined radios and apertures, they're stuck. Yeah. And so it may be that you want to write off those sunk costs in some cases, but that's got to be a conscious decision, and you've got to think about where it's a service that the public is relying on. How do you migrate, with appropriate lead time?
I would jump in here. As part of it is, I think we've got to change our mindset a bit on military satellite communications. And so the way we grew up is that the military designed, built, owned, and operated all of its own satellites for narrowband, wideband, and protected comms. Now we have a pretty robust commercial market out there that can do narrowband and wideband. Is it exactly the same? No. But can it do the mission? In almost all cases, yes, you can. You can do the mission with commercial systems. And so I think in the future, for narrowband and wideband, we ought to be moving to a system where we're not trying to buy the product. We're not trying to buy the satellites and operate them and have our own separate spectrum. We ought to be leasing. We ought to be working with commercial operators to use their systems and maybe use special waveforms that are unique to the military, that meet some additional military requirements in terms of protection and doing frequency hopping and a little bit of jam resistance where we need more protection than the private sector. Separate from this, though, is protected SATCOM. I don't think there will ever be a time that we want to rely on commercial as our primary means for nuclear command and control. I think most people agree with that. So that's separate. We need separate bandwidth allocation for that. That's got to be protected. It is a large chunk of bandwidth, but it's in a part of frequency spectrum people, at least right now, aren't trying to use. So we keep that aside, but for wideband and narrowband, we got to move to a model where we're buying as a service, not as a product.
So we know how to do this. We do it in fiber. We use commercial fiber all the time in the Defense Department. And we have dedicated things for special stuff. But we've been doing for 15 years, we've been buying, if you will, paying consortiums for fiber service for connectivity. There's no reason you can't do it in
If
space.
I can come back to the 3-letter acronym, though, the wideband AOA does encompass services as well as a whole variety of intermediate outcomes between just strictly buying on the commercial market and building your own. So that's all in the mix, which is why it's a harder one to do, right? Because you're comparing some apples and some oranges, and you got to figure out what's essential to fruit.
So let me, for you acquisition nerds, for the two of you that are out there, let me just mention one other thing about services.
We might have more than 2 of those here.
Well, it took me 3.
Vago's here.
Vago's are not. The one thing about a service, though, that this isn't space launch, which we still are struggling with. This is a hard issue. is we're paying for the development of the launch vehicle and public-private partnerships. It's probably a lot of the money that was in that last presentation. But then we turn around and buy it as a service. So you got to think about that for a second. You know, we're not paying these commercial companies to launch these commercial satellites and then buying them as a service. That's what we're doing in launch. And so I think that the challenge is, what's the government rights in helping develop these commercial entities for space launch? Because they're not, you know, they're a lot of the money that they're getting is from the government.
When this gets to the human capital piece too, there's been a lot of talk about other transaction authority
Yes.
lately. And we've had other transaction authority for
Forever.
20 years
Yes.
plus now, right?
It caused FCS to go bad, is what I heard. It's a joke.
Well, not really. Not really. It's hard to use those sorts of authorities. It requires much more expertise on the part of the government staff and folks like FFRDC, supporting them to write
Yes.
a blank sheet contract for something completely novel.
Yes.
And so the fact that, under Bill's leadership and others, we've been investing in upskilling our acquisition workforce in the Department of Defense is important. But you got to play with the big boys, the high dollar lawyers and financial modelers when you're talking about these kinds of blank sheet public-private partnerships using OTAs. And, again, the GAO is going to come and look at these.
Right.
The department shouldn't be afraid of that risk. But it's got to do everything it can to give the people who are trying to do their best as contracting officers and lawyers in government, give them the tools they need to be successful.
So we had the first competitive bid for space launch was a GPS. And if some of you remember, I've got gray hair from it, that was the time when there was a bill banning the use of the RD-180 engine. And so ULA, United Launch Alliance, was publicly saying, if that doesn't get waived, we're not going to bid. I called it the blazing saddle strategy. If you don't do this, I'm going to shoot myself. And so in the middle of all of that, a consortium of several industry groups, led by one of them is the current USD R&E, wrote a letter to the SecDef and said, well, if United Launch Alliance won't bid the Atlas V, let us bid it. Because the government helped develop Atlas V. That's the rocket that the RD-180 is on. Well, within 24 hours, ULA put out a statement and said the government has no rights to the Atlas V, which was true.
Well, okay, I've got another question for you. I mean, you've got the billionaires, Elon Musk and Jeff Bezos, pumping a lot of money into space. You have 2 years here with this budget agreement of budgets that you may not see again 2 years from now. So what are maybe the top 3 things that you'd like to see move forward rapidly these next 2 years with this, which might be a golden period for space?
You got to get the MDA thing built immediately.
That's my one.
Don't stop studying. You got to get that built. You got to fund it and get that done. You got to get you got to get that started. Because once you start programs, at least you got some momentum. Witness OCX, and then the second thing you got to do is you got to get the follow on the AEHF and SBIRs on. Just get that immediately. Probably disaggregated architecture and exploiting commercial. Got to get that done immediately.
I would agree with that we got to get going on our next generation for missile warning and protected comms. I don't necessarily know that it's disaggregated, but dispersed for sure. Something that's more resilient. We got to agree on an architecture, move forward. The follow on to advanced HF was TSAT. TSAT was canceled 9 years ago. 9 years we've been waiting. It's a complicated problem. It's a complicated question. How do you do this? What's the right solution? We don't necessarily all agree, but we've got to move forward with something, because I can guarantee you the wrong answer is to continue debating it and not move forward. Because, like it's been said before, I'll say it again, the threats are advancing. What other countries are doing, they are making progress and countering the advantages that our space systems provide. No one wants a conflict that extends into space. The best way to prevent that is to make it not worth someone's while. to do that, to have systems that are resilient, that they know that they are unlikely to succeed or it's too costly to succeed. It is not worth any potential benefit they could get. So let's keep the conflict down on Earth, not extending into space. But we've got to move forward. We can't just keep buying more of the same systems. We got to move forward, and yeah, we want to do it faster, but we have to do it different. It's got to be a different system. So let's nail down what those requirements are, what the architecture is, and go.
So the ORS office, I think it was ORS 5, did something with our fellow FFRDC, Lincoln Labs, that's really encouraging. They put up a space situational awareness satellite. It was launched, I think, in August. I think it was on a SpaceX Falcon 9. And I think from concept to building it to launch was 2 years. You know, so this can be done. This can be done.
Part of the problem of going fast, though, is our budget process. And especially if it's a major program. If you're an MDAP, a major defense acquisition program, I'm sorry, but the MDAP process does not work for quick, innovative programs. Just getting a funding line started in the budget, that's a 2-year process. And you know, you look at the pace of innovation in the private sector, within 2 years, you've got a whole new generation of technology already. So we spend 2 years just trying to get a funding line in, and then we start it and we try to carry it out over 10 years. It doesn't work for a lot of these space systems. We've got to move out of that system somehow.
The length of time from initial RFP to contract for sole source when I was in the Air Force was 18 months. Sole source.
That's after the 2 years of getting it into the budget.
After the 2 years, after the 5 years of arguing what it is, after all the AOAs, after the money, then it still takes you 18 months to do a contract, and, you know, and definitize the contract. So all of this stuff, you know, that's why Jamie points out OTA. That's what the hope is with OTA. You can do this stuff really fast, but it takes expertise to do it and not to make some bad deals.
Right. I mean, is the Air Force or the Pentagon, are either of those institutions equipped to handle that?
So we know that there's parts that are, right?
Which parts?
Well, so there's a reason that ORS has been renamed the Space Rapid Capabilities Office. The Rapid Capabilities Office, the Air Force Rapid Capabilities Office, has used a whole bunch of clever and effective contracting strategies, and I can't say much more than that. But I think the biggest, to your question, the biggest advantage of having more money is you can manage through a transition without some of the ugly trades that you have to do to get through a transition when you don't have the additional money, right? The difference between where we are today and where we were in the 1960s when we were creating all of these space capabilities in their first instances is we now have people who are depending on these capabilities. There's an entire enterprise, and you know, the $7 billion number is probably not the right number for total space budget, but it is a small percentage of the total defense establishment because the total defense establishment does an enormous amount of stuff. Right. And they're almost all relying on space, and it's deeply integrated into their concept of operations, into their hardware designs, and everything else. So space is a hugely important domain, but it's not the only one. And the domains are ever more tightly integrated. So what we have with this additional money is an opportunity to manage risk to continuity of service for all of these functions and roles and abilities that have come from space for the last several decades that warfighters are banking on, while simultaneously transitioning to more resilient and capable systems that are going to be able to persist in a contested future environment. So the additional money, I was actually a little surprised that it didn't go further in belt and suspenders here, or maybe belt and levitation, pants levitation system, or whatever, something more, a little more. We were in a very difficult place through sequester, trying to figure out how to make a transition that we felt was necessary without losing that capability. And when General Hyten thinks about this, right, he's worried about the capability being denied on the nation's worst day because somebody's gone after it. And that is a really important day to worry about. But the whole joint team is worrying 365 and a quarter days per year. They gotta make the force function all over the world. I will say we missed an opportunity when Bill and I were in government. Congressman Cooper this morning had the most compelling argument that would have enabled me as an Air Force comptroller and Bill in acquisition to secure the money needed for space, even in a room full of fighter pilots. And that was his loss of distance to green indicator if we have GPS challenged, right? I mean, that was the killer case that obviously would have upended the budget.
If any of you are talking to anybody who's a GPS person, ask them how much of society uses GPS for timing versus position.
Yeah.
And what's really scary when you realize, because it's so easy when you're designing something, whether you're in the financial world or you just use the GPS for your time. It's and so that's where you say, holy crap, look at that. It's not just your GPS in your car or your.
Right. Well, a lot of the discussions have focused on how China is moving a lot faster than the United States, how Russia's, and they're spending a lot less money. What are they doing that the U.S. is not?
Well, I mean, it's pretty public what they're doing. Well, we haven't talked about machine learning and artificial intelligence, but just pick that area. China said it's going to dominate the world in 10 years. And they're putting money against it and people against it. I talked about the hypersonic glide vehicles. They're ahead of us. As Bob Work, former deputy, says, the Chinese looked at 100,000 feet to 300,000 feet and said, that's a domain we can dominate. And that's what they're doing right now. So, and what they're doing is, I don't know, a lot of us have looked at them and said, gee, do they have the same development cycles as us? For us, a typical development program planned for 5 years, takes 7. I don't know that they're developing things much more rapidly than us, but they're making decisions and they're experimenting and they're fielding. And that's the piece which we haven't been doing. We haven't been making the decisions and the fielding has been very limited.
I'm always a little cautious about, again, back to the don't panic point. We don't have complete visibility into the PPBE equivalent of the Chinese military, right? And nor the Russian. And so they've clearly set key strategic goals, and we see those goals oftentimes when they roll out in public speeches. And then we watch and we see, things happening in the world that demonstrate that they're following those goals. We don't always necessarily see the AOA, right, or the thinking about setting the strategic goal. So I think we should be conscious of what we know and what we don't know. But what we have seen is, at the strategic level, clear priority setting, and then execution sustained against it.
That's right.
And especially in the space community, right, if we're going to be critical of ourselves, we got to say we do change our answers pretty dang frequently. And some of that's because we go up to bat and we strike out and we go back and we change our swing. But, the solutions, our solution set seems to swing around quite a bit. And some of that's natural, right? We start thinking more seriously about resiliency, and then we realize, well, we don't have a good measure for it, and then we develop a measure for it, right? Some of this is natural growth, but consistency is a really valuable thing when you're talking about sophisticated development.
I would also sort of underscore the lack, or our lack of strategic clarity on terms of great power competition within the missile defense department. I would just, again, kind of circle around to a document or a product in the Missile Defense Review that, no kidding, connects the dots between the NDS and the greater air and missile defense problem is gonna raise some antibodies.
You're saying a missile defense strategy that's aimed at great powers, not second tier.
Exactly.
That's a different.
That's going to raise, and I'm not talking about the perfect shield, but the kind of things to say these are the capabilities. It's not about a Scud or a North Korean purely ballistic thing. But no kidding, we want to go and pursue this over here. Let's look at what's within the realm of the possible there. That I think is gonna raise some antibodies in the next couple months. Because we never think about that. We're gonna ignore that problem.
Well, it's certainly fair to say that even the second tier, third tier, militaries are being able to get more sophisticated right? We see that, and that's publicly clear.
Once you can do a salvo of tens of missiles more than that, the difference between a great power and a not so great power starts to go away in missile
Yeah.
defense.
This is probably a whole nother conference, though.
Well, to get back to the Chinese, question and their advancement, and it's not just China, it's others as well, but China is kind of pushing far out. Let's be perfectly honest, they're not 10 feet tall. When it comes to their space capabilities, they are still playing catch up. They haven't developed everything that we have, but they are catching up because we haven't been moving that quickly, especially not in the national security space community. We see them trying to imitate a booster being able to land on the ground, and they're trying to catch up to SpaceX, not the military, when they do that. But technology is important, but technology itself is not an enduring advantage. As we can develop the greatest technology in the world, others will copy it pretty quickly, right? There is not a big first mover advantage when it comes to technology that's going to be publicly visible. The real measure for a military is, can they take that technology and integrate it into their operations, right? Can they actually use it in an operational manner, and do they develop operational concepts around it that can effectively exploit the advantage of the technology? And we should never forget, too, that we are not in a symmetric competition when it comes to space and when it comes to China. We rely on a defense strategy where our military needs to have global reach, global power projection. We have a strategy to play an away game. And so we need to be able to operate over longer distances. That's why space is so important to us, is to operate over those long distances, even in a denied environment. Countries like China, Russia, at least for now, they're really optimizing their military to operate in their theater, along their periphery, not too far out. So they don't need to have all the same space capabilities that we have in order to effectively execute that strategy. What they need, though, are counter space weapons, things that will limit our ability to use space systems to project power. And so that's the most worrisome in terms of space technology development that we see, is that they're investing more into counter space weapons. And there are signs that they are thinking about integrating those counter space weapons into their operations and the way they fight.
Well, I'd love to pull on that some more, but that's all we have time for.
Thank you, Jen.
So thank you, everyone.
All right.
Thank you.
That's all.
Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today.